So my name is Arun Parakat. I lead up Baker Tilly's EMEA Life Sciences practice, and I work out of the Barbican office in London. I'm really looking forward to this exciting discussion, which is top of the tray for many of you in life sciences companies. And that's the topic of evidence and evidence generation. And joining me today is a senior and diverse expert panel for this discussion who cover different areas: rare disease, infectious disease, medtech. Together, what we will do essentially is an exploration of the single most consideration that you will have when you're looking to launch in different markets, and that is evidence generation strategy. Firstly, we will meet David Gregory. Uh, he's a practice principal at Baker Tilly. Then Grace Macalino, who's the global director of medical affairs at Baker Tilly. Then Sheila Padya, consultant in rare disease, market access, and evidence strategies. David, Grace, Sheila, would you share a round of introductions with our audience, please?
Okay. And I assume not all at once, right, Arun? One at a time?
not all at once, if okay. That's possible.
All right, I'll start. I'll start. So David Gregory, welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar today. We're going to impart some knowledge on you, and hopefully you can grab 2 or 3 kernels that'll make a difference for your organization. So I'm the market access practice lead at Baker Tilly. Have been in the life sciences sector for 20 years plus. I grew up in the provider and payer space and have brought that knowledge, over to the life sciences sector. And we largely focus on evidence generation and health economics. We do have a domestic focus. So I will be, a lot of my comments will be around the United States and those stakeholders and kind of how evidence generation, leaves an impression on those stakeholders for sure. So happy to be here today. I'll probably be taking mostly a domestic point of view, but very much looking forward to the panel today.
Thank you, David. Grace, please.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Happy to go next. I'm Grace Macalino. I'm an epidemiologist by training, and I'm a director here at Baker Tilly. I head up our medical affairs and evidence solutions practice. I'm a clinical researcher, and I've been doing work on evidence generation my entire career. My area of expertise is infectious diseases, primarily related to HIV to begin with, and did a lot of work in sexually transmitted infections as well. The work that we do with life sciences is really to support evidence generation needs broadly. And I'm excited to have this discussion as it relates to market access and the value and where and how it makes a difference for different stakeholders. So very excited to this discussion.
Great to meet you, Grace. Sheila, please.
Thanks so much. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. I am not an employee of Baker Tilly, but I hope to be working with them on a number of projects in the future. But my history is a provider kind of level. So I have commissioned rare disease service provision in the past for the National Health Service in the UK, and latterly went on to lead what's known as the Highly Specialised Technology Programme at NICE, so HTA evaluation. I predominantly now consult in the life sciences industry in rare diseases and have a real passion and interest in supporting organizations to really understand the challenges in the rare disease space, but really thinking about what the future holds for market access and how can we really demonstrate the value of a product through undertaking appropriate evidence generation activity, so that when we are getting into the payer and the provider conversations and negotiations, we're on a really strong footing. And that we can really demonstrate the value of the product in the different jurisdictions. And I'm competing the other side of the pond with David. So David is going to give the US perspective, and I'm hoping to give a UK/European perspective on some of the challenges that I've seen in that space.
Perfect. Thank you all. I'll go on to some of the objectives that we have for our discussion. So we want to firstly look into the diversity of risks that many of you will have when you're launching in markets, be it US, be it in the EU. So that's the first objective, a set of perspectives that we'll gather from our panelists. but also really want to hear from yourselves, the audience, also contribute to some of those perspectives that we will generate together. The second one, of course, is we want to explore how evidence strategies can really power market access success in new markets, but also what are the commonalities which may exist between medtech and pharma, and if there are no commonalities, what kind of dissimilarities are there? The third one, of course, is an objective wherein we want to pull in a case study. In this case, it'll be in rare, with Sheila in the rare disease area, and look at how evidence can really drive commercial success in rare disease area, of course, with an example. So before that, I wanted to set some context. Now, life sciences companies face many complexities when you're launching in key global markets, be it in US, in EU, or UK. In the US, it's estimated that over a third of all launches fail. Over 12 years spent developing a new medicine, upwards of $1 billion spent on research and development of new medicines. Of the 25,000 odd chemical compounds trialed, you average 5 gain marketing approval in a market. EFPI survey, the latest survey from 2022, showed that the time to reimbursement, average time to reimbursement in Europe, continues to be as long as 511 days. So market access is a real challenge. Gaining patients access to the medicine is a real challenge. Now, if you look at launch failures, we find that predominantly the launches succeed or fail, in this case, mainly due to market access, limited market access understanding, but also poor understanding of customer needs and product differentiations. That is also a challenge which many launches suffer from. And if you look at the impact really is that over 40% of all launches underperform Wall Street expectations by up to 20% in the first 3 years in terms of sales. A success key in our minds would be the ability of any launch strategy to have the right evidence of additional clinical benefit and cost effectiveness, also being able to negotiate with the access stakeholders in the different markets, and being able to be affordable and timely in terms of product delivery to patients in different markets. So evidence success is when it really aligns business goals with product value and generates the right kind of trust amongst the different stakeholders that are there in the market, given the current trial data that you have with yourselves. So that, in essence, is the holy crux of launch in many markets. I'll firstly go on to the nub of our discussion, and we'll start off with a question, a polling question to the audience who have joined us. And that question really is all about where does the current state of your evidence generation strategy sit? Is it existent? If it is existent, is it in a siloed location, in a place in the company? If it is developing slowly, are the internal parties all engaged with a strategy? And that if it is developing with some urgency, is there funding in place? And if funding is in place, is it appropriate, which is option E. So you've got a minute or so to kind of debate it, think about it. Meanwhile, I'll bring to the panel a couple of pointers, and this is all about what are the perspectives on evidence that we have when we look at from different markets. David, do you want to have a look at some of these questions that we have in front of us?
Sure. I agreed to be on the panel, so I think I should participate, right?
Sure.
So yes, and just to be clear, right, the polling results will come through in the next minute to 90 seconds, and we will share those polling results with the audience, because sometimes it's very helpful for you to hear kind of where your peers are and kind of where the market is, right? So let's just do it around the horn while we're waiting for those polling results. Around that first question and evidence strategy and differences in evidence requirements between the EU and the US. Sheila and I are facing off somewhat. She's EU, I'm US, and Grace has got both. And so I think we've got the right panel to do this. I would say just very basically that our payer stakeholders in the US are very sensitive to the different payer setups and the different provider setups in different countries across the world. And every patient journey is a different experience in a different country. And so it is hard. It is not impossible, but it is hard, to have, EU research translate into the US and vice versa. We've certainly got instances where it has worked, but it is difficult, and that has a lot to do with the fact that the care process is different by country, and that definitely influences the evidence generation strategy. Grace, did you have a thought there?
Yeah, for sure. So it was very helpful for me to learn where and how the EU sort of addresses that value in the conversation. It happens, right? It definitely happens earlier, right? The NICE review needs and includes sort of how a drug or device compares to what is already out there in the market, right? As opposed to in the United States, where you get FDA, not even just approval, but just sort of like, consideration. And then, there's the work that needs to be done to work with payers to get coverage, and that whole sort of market access or payer outreach pathway becomes a whole other thing separate from the EU. So I definitely found that to be enlightening to me, like, oh, that's very different in terms of where and how value is getting addressed, right? Differences. But I agree, David. I think the evidence need to be unique to the situation, right? Because that patient journey is going to look different. What access or to other treatments, how diseases are diagnosed, all of that is very country specific and needs to be brought into the consideration as you understand and appreciate how access and payers will handle what that looks like, right? Sheila, what are your thoughts? Because I know you actually have that EU perspective for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think sort of on the face of it, I think if I look at, as you say, Grace, when at what point in the pathway is evidence and the kind of generation of that evidence considered in the different approaches and the different countries, and in terms of sort of the UK and the EU, it's definitely seen much earlier. Definitely the regulators are much more hot on that topic, if you will, wanting to kind of really understand. There is a real need for that evidence to really show more value earlier in that pathway than I feel maybe in the US system. Put simply, I feel like in the US system, and you both can correct me if I've kind of interpreted this incorrectly, is that the FDA provides an approval, and actually it's at the moment, in the absence of new policy kind of coming into play, it's the payer negotiations that dictate the access to the market, more or less. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think in the EU and the UK, you've got a situation where you've got a body like NICE or another HTA body that then undertakes an assessment of that evidence to demonstrate the value, and then you go into the negotiations around the price and the access and so on. But I do wonder if I can be a bit cheeky and bring in the new policy that's coming into the US around the Inflation Reduction Act and the impacts that might create in terms of evidence generation in the US. So David, you suggested it's difficult, different markets, different healthcare systems. But I sense with that coming in, there may be a slightly different requirement for the US and the evidence generation activities to be slightly more aligned to a degree to enable those negotiations to happen at the appropriate levels when the Act starts to come into play. And I appreciate it's not for rare conditions and so on at the moment. It's going to be kind of for more prevalent, but I do feel it's the kind of start of a different era for evidence generation.
Yep. Yeah, we can, that certainly is the intent and the hope, and we'll see how it plays out, because a lot of new things have unintended consequences, right? So stay tuned on that one for sure. Arun, before you chime in, I'll share the polling results, which I was kind of hoping the results would be flipped, that we'd have the preponderance of the audience saying E, that they've got this under control, but actually, the preponderance of the audience responded A, that their evidence generation strategy is non-existent. 36% of you said that your evidence generation strategy is basically nowhere to be found, which is interesting, and could be the reason why you're on this call. And then on the other end, in terms of having some urgency and appropriate funding for evidence generation, we've got less than 10% of you saying that you fall into that category. It's actually 8%. And then the three middle categories are 21%, 26%, and 10% for degrees of readiness and evidence generation. So thank you very much for responding to the first polling question. And so panel, we've certainly got some advanced folks, and we've also got some folks that are on the front end of their evidence generation strategy, and have silver lining is there's plenty of opportunity to kind of shape that as early as possible, right, in the process. So and so Arun, those were the polling questions, but did you want to add any comments on this slide before we move on around the differences?
I was just summarizing my thoughts while Grace was mentioning, I think the differences that does exist between EU markets and US. I think my thought, one of the thoughts was, as she was describing those differences, and there are differences, especially, it also is disease specific to an extent, isn't it, Grace, to an extent. So if you look at rare disease, the patient populations are spread out in different parts of the world. You could probably even look at it from a single evidence generation strategy perspective. But on the other hand, if you're looking at infectious diseases, then you have epidemiology, which is so different in different markets that you almost need to have a more nuanced evidence strategy than you would think for rare. I think, Sheila, what are your thoughts on that before we can move on to the next slide?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. So I think I agree in that in the rare space, you can hopefully undertake some activity that's kind of more consistent across different markets. However, I'm going to reflect now on my experience during COVID. So I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to lead the COVID effort at NICE during that period. And as you can imagine, like every other country around the world, everybody was looking for the answer. And in that conversation, when we were looking at trial readouts, particularly when they were coming from different geographies, the question was, how generalizable is this evidence to our healthcare system? What kind of gaps do we see? How do we understand the applicability in this scenario to our system? For example, do they have a similar setup in terms of A&E or ER admissions? Do they have the same kind of line of access to healthcare physicians in this country as they do to ours? What would be their normal standard of care in this infectious disease scenario, and does it fit? So I think there are those questions that often come up in the different countries. So it's how do you balance out the consistent need for evidence generation across all markets, but bringing some of those nuanced things in without creating a snowball effect and a massive resource implication. So just reflecting on the poll questions, David, it might be that some of these people on the call don't have a budget for lots of evidence generation. And that's often a challenge, prioritizing and balancing what's going to add enough value for the resource we have, but also be mindful of the gaps and the uncertainties it still leaves behind, even though you've undertaken as much as you possibly can within the resources that you've got.
Cool. Sheila, on that note, I think very interesting. Let me go on to the next polling question and bring in some more audience thoughts into the mix, if I could. So the next polling question really is, again, to the audience, what in your mind are key drivers of that crucial role that evidence strategy, of course, it's crucial, I paraphrase it, in terms of a launch kind of situation. But the crucial role that evidence strategy really plays post trials. So trial data is there. Once trials are in play, it has been conducted. Possibly these are real world evidence observational studies that we're talking of. So is it all about then establishing standards of care or baselines? Is it all about gaps that exist in cost effectiveness data, clinical benefit data that we were not able to grab and we were not able to collate in the first instance during trials, RCTs maybe? That's number two, and then compare to comparators, of course. C, a need for outcomes data to support pricing. D, gaining prescribing change with best practice data. And last one being corporate brand building. So those are the kind of options. Do again have a minute to kind of think through what are the key drivers in your mind for evidence strategy post trials. Again, David, your perspective on this, on drivers in evidence generation and similarities that exist between pharma and medtech.
Yeah, that question there, and we'll go around the horn here quickly while we're waiting for results on polling question number 2. But commonalities in pharma versus medtech. I may play Captain Obvious on this one, but research does need to be published, right? And for those of you in the audience, publication takes time, right? And so evidence generation is not a quick thing. It does require planning. It probably needs to start earlier than you think it should. Whatever time you think it should start, it probably should start a year before that, because evidence generation takes time. And it needs to be peer reviewed and published in order for it to be effective anywhere in the world, really. Maybe there's some exceptions, but I think that's just the kind of the golden rule with regard to evidence generation. So that's one common thing, and is that peer reviewed aspect to it. Otherwise, there are a lot of differences, and we can talk about that as the panel develops here. But Grace, your thoughts on pharma versus medtech?
Yeah, I definitely agree and want to at least highlight what you just said, right? As an epidemiologist, as a scientist at my core, right? Evidence is evidence. The first slide that you put up there, Arun, that talked about trust, right? Building that trust is really the rigor in the science. And then I think, David, you going further to saying that that's why those peer-reviewed journal articles are valuable, because then that really does hold up the evidence in a way that it stood the test of peer review, to have folks believe in that, right? And it's where companies can best and both trust as well as know that it was rigorous, so that they different stakeholders can make informed choices in terms of payers or users ultimately, right? And then I think that's maybe where the difference lies in terms of yes, I think foundationally that it should be similar between pharma and medtech, and then I think who makes the choices as far as coverage and cost and all those things maybe looks a little differently. So it's more in the operations, if you will, don't you think, David? It is sort of what I'm learning, as opposed to it needing different kinds of evidence, perhaps, right? Because at the end of the day, if your evidence is rigorous and correct, then it really is understanding what are the needs of unique stakeholders in terms of what are their needs to understand, right, to make their choices. So I think it really is more a operational difference.
Yeah, I would just add to that before Sheila, you chime in, that one of the big differences is I'll call med tech all or nothing. In the United States,
Yes,
you know, you can get FDA approval, but in terms of getting covered by CMS, which is the national federal government, or by the private payers, it's kind of all or nothing. You either get covered or you don't. In pharma land, you know, there are degrees of coverage, right? You can get onto a tier, you can get onto a lower tier with more patient cost sharing, or you can get onto a very higher tier, you know, that has less patient cost sharing, has more market access, but you're getting up there based on evidence, right? You know, so evidence kind of drives the level of access on the pharma side of the world. And so it's not all or nothing, right? So I just draw that distinction. You know, Grace, is maybe one of the things you were alluding to, that, you know, where the operational differences start to emerge.
Correct.
So I'm sorry, Sheila, go ahead.
No, this is really interesting, and I think, you know, I'm with both of you in that, you know, you do need evidence for both pharma and medtech. I suppose for me, you know, that validated, credible evidence is the gold, you know, is the gold standard, and we should always be aiming to achieve that. However, I think for medtech, it's really difficult, right? So, you know, it's a device or some kind of element that's potentially being put into a patient surgically. It's slightly more complicated to run a trial in the way that you would for a therapy or a medicine. And I think this is where it's important to think about, how are we going to generate that in the best possible way? What's the approach that we need to take, and how do we create, you know, the right environment to create that evidence? And one of the things I'm really, you know, and I talk about this because I think it's important that NICE have started to think about sort of that early value assessment piece in medtech, and thinking about how they can generate evidence whilst it's being used, so real world evidence to support the use. They've introduced a new program thinking about early value assessment for medtech products, and being able to, first of all, identify those products that will have value in the current healthcare system. So what are the priorities of the healthcare system? How can some of the medtech products that are in the pipeline support the priorities of the healthcare system? And then thinking about, what is the currently available data? What does it look like? What are the gaps in that data? And are there opportunities in the kind of operating landscape to be able to collect this data that would be validated and credible and provide the right information for those decisions to be made? And then helping companies in that space think about how they can do that, and supporting them through that process. And I do think that's a really fantastic way to enable medtech to get to patients, because it's really important. And I think we underestimate how much the world is changing, and many more products are coming available in that kind of digital and medtech space. So we need to be more creative in terms of our evidence generation strategies. And I think this program is going to be a really good program to keep an eye on, to see how it develops, whether it delivers the results it's hoping to deliver, and whether there are different ways of generating that evidence that would give the credibility and the validity needed in order for payers to be confident, for patients to feel like they're getting a good high priority, high level product, and for clinicians to feel confident about using it, and not, in the case of the US, having implications and consequences. I'm not saying the NHS doesn't, but it's, again, different systems have different management of risk approaches that they need to consider.
Great points, Sheila. Let me, Arun, I'll just interject with polling results too.
Please.
So our top response was choice B. You know, over a third of you, 37%, said, you know, that your evidence generation is focused on cost effectiveness, looking at added clinical benefit data, you know, and comparators. The next response is very interesting, and I think very important. You know, 26% of you say gaps in establishing baselines and standards of care. Boy, ain't that the truth? That you would think that the standard of care is nice and clear, but those lines have blurred. You know, with Sheila, as she just indicated, with a lot of the innovation that's going on now, and how the U.S. payers think about standard of care versus how clinicians in the US or around the world think about standard of care, not everybody defines it the same way, right? And I do think it's not a given, that companies, should just know from the literature what the standard of care is that they're competing against. Sometimes you actually have to go out and generate evidence just to prove or to show what that is, right? So that's interesting that about a quarter of you said that was the reason for your evidence generation strategy. Another 20% said outcomes data. And then it was a minority response in terms of gaining prescribing best practice data, and corporate brand building was about 11%. So most of you were in that kind of cost effectiveness, standard of care, outcomes data realm, which makes a lot of sense. So,
David, do you mind if I
make again for polling question 2? Go ahead.
Yeah. David, do you mind if I make a comment on that and the standard of care piece? So
yes.
If you're looking at sort of the EU HTA process, which is now going to be kind of more collaborative, I suppose, across the EU, there's a real challenge there. So you've got 27 member states who probably have slightly different standards of care. There's a real concern about how that approach will assess standards of care, agree on the comparators, agree on what evidence is going to be kind of appropriate to be able to demonstrate clinical effectiveness, not even cost effectiveness, just clinical effectiveness of a treatment. So the work around the standards of care, I think, is going to get harder going forward than it is easier, unfortunately, for those people who suggested that was an area of concern.
Yeah, but I mean, not to beat it up too much, but I mean, it's super important. If there's one thing you take from this, it's that in order to not burn cash on studies that end up not giving you the value you expect them to, if you pick the wrong standard of care or pick one that's not going to be relatable to the stakeholder that you want to satisfy the most, that can be a death knell, to the effectiveness of your study, right? So, oftentimes there's a lot of focus on how am I going to capture the treatment data, but to Sheila's point and to this survey, the idea of locking down the right standard of care is super important.
And David, just to add one point, I'm focusing on the second question. I do think that really understanding that literature, despite it being difficult, Sheila, and I definitely hear you, it's going to be harder to know and understand, but you really need to do your homework, understand the literature, despite what guidelines might say. There are definitely ways to understand exactly what our practice is, with the specific clinician groups in terms of what exactly is treatment practices, and knowing and understanding as much as you can of what's out there is going to be really, really important. So that, to David's point, you're really investing in exactly the right study with the right comparator group, like asking and exploring the right outcomes. I think those are really important points to make, because you definitely do not want to be at the end before you're realizing those questions. And truth be told, definitely like in rare diseases in particular, or when there's not a lot of data out there, leaning on both understanding the literature, but are there other constructs out there that you can learn from and glean from, not assuming that just because there's nothing means there's nowhere else you can go, right? That there are lots and lots of other either therapeutic areas or ways, constructs of, disease areas that have, maybe been through this before or a little bit ahead of the curve because, they've explored these opportunities. And we've definitely had specific examples of where we've been able to lean on other disease states or other therapeutic areas and learn from those examples as well.
Cheers. Thanks, Grace. I think I'll just go on to the next poll, because I think there is, on a similar note, I think pretty much, I think there is, I think we touched upon evidence strategies, disparities even in different geographies, but also I think there was this polling question, which, and I think Sheila also brought up, the joint HTA kind of proposal that is quite the talk actually in market access circles in Europe, and the way in which we will kind of surmount the problem of 27 standards of care and make it single will be interesting for many pharma companies, but not just in evidence terms. But leaving that aside, this question of barriers, to put it mildly, to build a holistic evidence strategy. Is this even holistic? I think hopefully not a grand word, but the point really is, it hopefully does not give the connotations of the joint HTA, Sheila. But at the same time, it is a objective that is worth aiming for. I think that's the point of this question pretty much. If it was possible to have this holistic evidence strategy, I think the question is, what are the key barriers? Uh, is it pain in internal stakeholder alignment? Is that the big challenge, or is it just the way in which risk and innovation is considered by different stakeholders within a pharma company or a medtech company? And it is also, is it C, for instance, is it about how we use the end deliverables? D, is it about managing those external stakeholders, be it agencies, be it regulatory agencies, or be it even agencies who provide services to yourselves? Is it E, specific launch priorities that you have for a certain product? And F, is it about lack of strategic view at a functional level? So there is a set of options here. Again, it's an audience participation call that we seek here. It'd be grand if you could contribute to it, because I think it'll make the conversation a bit more richer. In terms of the next question, which I'll bring it back to David, uh, the barriers in the use of evidence by healthcare stakeholders, the very question that we have also posed to the audience. So, if I'll bring it back to you, David. What are your thoughts?
Well, there are several of them, and I'm sure Grace and Sheila and you will articulate many more. But I think I think cost is an obvious barrier because there's a lot of effort that has to go into designing studies and getting primary data. In the U.S., there are some retrospective data sets that are available for new companies that may not be all that helpful if there isn't a lot of retrospective experience, to rely on. Now, for standard of care, there are some data sets in the United States that can certainly benefit your definition or refining the definition of your standard of care. So, I think certainly real world evidence can play a role. We haven't really called that out yet, versus prospective clinical studies, right? So there's that whole decision point that needs to be made. But the data barriers are going to vary by region, and by jurisdiction, and also by which stakeholders you're looking to satisfy. I was going to make a comment on the prior slide that we highly recommend that every study you consider to satisfy more than one stakeholder. So try not to think of it as I'm going to run this study to satisfy the payers. I'm going to run this study to satisfy the providers, and I'm going to run this study to satisfy the regulators. Right? That can be a very costly view of the world, and we really recommend that you step back and look at studies that I think the word holistic was used on a prior slide. Kind of give it a holistic view, right? To make sure that you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. Grace, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, if you think about it from that evidence perspective, right? Evidence should meet the needs that answer the next right questions, right? And then from that vantage point, you should get a chance to answer more than one stakeholder. But I love that because I think folks, it's hard to not get myopic at times, right? Oh, we need to answer this question for this group. Let's go, right? And to be more broad from the jump. I also think that I did not actually make up the question. So whoever did, kudos, because I think it's important to call out that sometimes even internally, there can be some, like different perspectives or challenges in terms of like which is the right evidence need that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later, right? And the idea of the value of having a strategy, a holistic strategy, bringing together those perspectives from the jump, we've definitely seen makes a big difference in terms of timelines for sure, right? In terms of getting folks aligned sooner rather than later. As far as a company deciding like where to prioritize, where to invest money, kind of addressing, I just thought that that was an interesting thing on the list of choices that we provided for folks to consider and include, because sometimes the barriers literally are even just internal in terms of what's the next study we should fund being challenging because folks internally might not be able to align. So I just wanted to add that. And yes, you brought up cost barrier. I think maybe the other important thing is as there's a lot of talk about all this great data being available, but I think the realization that access to those data are not as readily available as folks would like it to be. There's lots of AI. There's a lot of talk about getting access to these data, but I think there's still a time before we're going to be able to all have access to all those data, and just kind of being sort of realistic perhaps, or maybe, there are still some challenges and barriers to getting access to all the data we would like to is important to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I think this debate. I think we're still awaiting the poll question and the answers from the poll. David, any final thoughts? Because there is this conversation around patient-generated data, and also I think that there is patient engagement is another set of data points that is being sought, some increasingly by regulatory agencies, is being considered increasingly by regulatory agencies. But any thoughts from a medtech perspective? Is that something that you're seeing in the US, David?
Yes, it is definitely a trend. I would say that there's shades of gray around that for sure. So I'll try to weave my response into the polling results. Arun, because I know we're about 15 minutes from needing to land this plane, and I think we need to keep moving here. But certainly we'll add my 2 cents there. The top responses on polling question number 3, guys, was C and B. So ability to own and use the end deliverables and differing view of risk and innovation benefits. Those are the 2 largest barriers, followed closely by a lack of strategic view at a functional level, right? So those 3 kind of rose at the top. Almost a quarter responded to each of those 3, and then the other responses were less compelling. But certainly thank you to the audience for responding and kind of helping us reconfirm, some of the barriers, to holistic, generation for sure. So I think, yeah. So why don't do we have one more polling question?
I think we have one more. So I think the 4th polling question is really in terms of outcomes. I think outcomes of studies, that is not. So essentially, what type of study outcome is most impactful, especially seen from a market access perspective, is the question. Option A is it safety and effectiveness? B, is it about proof of mechanism of action? C, is it about cost effectiveness? Is that the study outcome that is most sought? D, is it about clinical utility, longitudinal clinical utility? And of course, E is it about head-to-head comparisons with two or more emerging interventions? So I think that's, so again, a minute to ponder upon it. And then we will do a quick round of panel discussion around the same topic. but essentially pull in Sheila at this point to do a brief scene setting around a rare disease case study that she has been party to. So, Sheila, do you want to briefly describe how we used evidence in this rare disease space and was able to launch this rare disease product?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Arun. So, Strimvelis for treating severe combined immunodeficiency. I suppose in terms of the role that I played at NICE, this was one of the first gene therapies that came to the program. So everybody was really excited about what it would hold. And I suppose the key factors for me in this space was that it was a serious fatal condition with a very small number of patients in terms of prevalence, and an even smaller number of incidence patients. So you're looking at no more than about 10 or 12 patients with this condition, and an incidence of maybe 1 up to 2 patients a year. Very, very small. So you can imagine the trial and the evidence generation activity needed to be really well thought through. And I suppose the key things that came out for me were that there was a real understanding of the comparator, which was the transplant that would be given in terms of for patients, and a real description of the patients that would benefit most in this space. So it was the ones that wouldn't have a matched donor for transplant that would benefit most, and the fact that they had done a very long-term study over the course of about 15 years. Now, I know that's quite frightening to think about, but it was a very, very rare condition. So being able to combine a number of studies over the course of time and be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of that long period was something that was really valued by the decision-making committee. And they were also committed to sort of long-term patient monitoring, so setting up a registry to ensure that they were able to give some information about that. It was clear from the conversations that they'd had a long conversation with both clinicians and patient groups. So going back to your question, Arun, I think it's really important that there is a holistic view of the evidence generation, that we're not always going to be able to answer all of the questions within the trial context. So bringing in KOLs as well as patients and patient groups who have experience of the disease and the therapy, being able to bridge the gap with qualitative data. It doesn't always have to be quantitative. I think it's really important to be able to bring all of those things in. So in essence, I think that the evidence and the strategy that was deployed here was really well constructed, really well thought through, and the value proposition that was put forward was very convincing for a committee to make a positive recommendation. They'd even thought about the fact that patients would have to travel to Italy to receive the therapy and stay there for a period of time. So they'd had conversations with the healthcare system about whether that would be something that they would be supportive of. And the patient group had conversations with parents of children, wanting to understand whether parents of children would be committed to undertaking that activity, traveling to Italy, staying there for 6 months to have the therapy and to have ongoing monitoring. So I suppose from an evidence generation strategy, they kind of tried to think of all of the stakeholders and all of the needs that they could address. Of course, there were some uncertainties, but because of the activity they'd undertaken, the committee was very much more comforted and felt positive in terms of recommending it for use going forward.
Sheila, thank you for that fascinating case study. So perhaps I'll bring it back to David because I think the poll answers are back. David has just come back. So do you want to have your perspective around those answers?
Yeah. So we have we have a kind of a wide disbursement of responses. I guess number one response was safety and effectiveness at 30%, followed by proof of mechanism of action, followed by cost effectiveness, and then D, longitudinal clinical utility was in the 4th spot, and then the head-to-heads in choice E was in the last spot at less than 10%, and that's interesting because and therein lies the challenge, right? Is a lot of evidence generation is threading the needle and figuring out exactly where you need to go with your outcomes and your study results and exactly what your stakeholders need, whether it's regulators, payers, providers, et cetera. I would have, my correct answer, and we can talk to the others. We focus on longitudinal clinical utility. And that was not that was actually the fourth most frequent response from the audience, with safety and effectiveness being number one. Safety and effectiveness is almost table stakes. You're not getting market access without safety, right? So there does need to be some basic safety studies, to also demonstrate basic effectiveness. But I look at that as almost table stakes, and that the real differentiator in terms of creating differential market access that can support your business objectives, it's more about showing beyond safety and effectiveness, does your pill or does your device or does your app, does it actually create a change in the patient experience or a change in resource consumption longitudinally? That's clinical utility. And we think that's where the action is from a pure market access standpoint, understanding that, safety and effectiveness is, as I said, table stakes. Those are the results on the last poll. And I don't know if, Grace, you had any thoughts on that, or Sheila, maybe Grace first.
Yeah, I agree. I'm surprised a little bit because from a market access standpoint, correct. The cost as well as the cost effectiveness, right? But one could argue clinical utility really needs to, there is a sense of cost sort of differential, if you will, with clinical, in thinking about clinical utility. It isn't just, clinical effectiveness, right? It really does bring in, cost as well as value, I guess, in that broader sense. So no, that is definitely very interesting. Definitely can hear, depending on if I think the last choice in terms of head-to-head comparison of two emerging interventions, maybe the interesting key there was they're both in emerging interventions as opposed to an existing one, right? If one was a long-standing one, you really would have to show your comparative effectiveness or added value, sort of like what's different about your product, whether it be a drug or a device from, something that's a long-standing, standard of care treatment or intervention in the space, right? So I think that would be important. I did have a couple of comments to the case study. I don't know. I'll let maybe Sheila speak to the poll first, if that's the right way to go. And but definitely, thank you for sharing that case study with us, Sheila.
No problem. Thanks so much. And I suppose my answer would be all of the above, because. But again, it's about kind of the depth and the breadth that you need to go into with all of those things. And it's a bit, as we said right at the front of this webinar, it's different systems, different conditions, different disease groups, different patients and needs. So, there may be kind of a strength in one area and a less likely, less needed activity in the other. But a very short analogy is if you were buying a car, you definitely want it to be safe. You would not be getting in it if it didn't have that. It's kind of like boilerplate. If you don't have that, then it's the same for medicines, right? And all of the other things are kind of the added value that we want to see. And if you've not demonstrated the added value, then people aren't buying it.
Yeah, for sure.
Sheila, perhaps I chime in. In fact, there is a question that also came up, which actually leads me back to your case study. Perhaps I quickly ask that question and also use that almost to chime in on the case study. Again, as I said, interesting thing that you brought out there was the use of patient data or patient engagement that you carried out, but also the fact that you had KOLs contribute to some of the narratives that you had to present back to NICE, I think, in this case. I think one of the questions was: is there a legitimate pathway to coverage through non-clinical real-world evidence? I think it points to that patient narrative kind of data, not just quantitative data, but also non-clinical real-world evidence such as patient narratives. Is there a real place for it? I know you almost shared an example of it. Of course, there is one, but is it more prevalent than that?
I mean, I think for me in rare diseases, there is a huge place for it because we don't know enough about rare diseases. So we're constantly trying to build a complete picture with fragmented pieces of a puzzle. And I think we underestimate the amount of knowledge, experience, and understanding that patients and patient groups can bring to answering some of these questions. And I think that if we are to engage them properly, and in the right way, we would find that some of that puzzle becomes more complete than the puzzle we might be wanting to present without their input. So for rare diseases, I'm a very strong advocate for engaging with both patient groups and KOLs because I think the literature just isn't enough.
Yeah. Thanks, Sheila. I think at this point, really a super discussion we've had, and time flew past too quickly. And I'm sure we just touched the bare broad outline of what we wanted to discuss here. But I think it just shows the complexity of what we're discussing, but also the experience that we have within this panel, and the multitude of those experiences that we can bring to this discussion. So thank you. Also, thanks to the audience for the participation, diligent participation in the polls, because there were 4 polls and we had some very good responses, and also sharing your perspectives through those polls. I hope you've had an informative discussion. Look forward to meeting you in a similar discussion in the very near future. But this was fabulous. Thank you. Thanks for this webinar time.